Bienvenue à tous. Welcome to all. This is the first meeting of the strategic dialogue on climate change policy research in Canada. This is a meeting that is organized by the Institut de l'Énergie Trottier and Uranos on behalf of the Climate Choices, which is a new institute that you will hear a bit more in a few minutes. And the goal of this meeting is really to get the experts on climate from around Canada to discuss about what are the issues that we need to study more, and also establish better link between these experts and Climate Choices, the new institute. I would like to thank the Ivy Foundation and the Trottier Family Foundation for supporting this activity, which is in a different format. So that's an unusual format for you and for us. We're trying this because of the COVID. So we hopefully are taking advantage of these of the limitations or of the constraints of this system. So rapidly, donc je voudrais parler un peu de la question de la langue. Vous pouvez intervenir dans la langue de votre choix. Toutefois, il n'y a pas de traduction simultanée, ce qui fait que la plupart des messages formels vont être en anglais. However, the website is bilingual, and I would encourage you to use both languages on the website. Also, for the breakout discussions, the last group, Group 5, is a group where we expect people to be able to intervene in both languages and understand each other. So if this is not your case, you can always change your group by sending an email to Alexander. So the main rules will be the Chatham rules. So essentially, we don't attribute to anybody what they're saying, but we can get what everybody is saying. We can notice. We'll have to enforce the schedule very tightly. We have the standard meeting etiquette. Don't forget on Zoom. So raise their hand if you need. You can use from the participant, or if you have a camera, you can raise your hand formally. Mute your microphone when you're not talking, and please make short interventions. And don't forget online discussions that we'll be taking on every team, so you can participate to all teams. And you can also participate with 4 teams where there's no group per se. And if you want to acknowledge territories, there are information on the nativeland.ca where you can find all the information you need to acknowledge the right territory. So I will stop here and we'll pass the buck to Kathy Newhook, who is the chair of this team. So Kathy, it's up to you.
Thank you, Normand. My name is Kathy Newhook. I am joining you today from beautiful and also very, very rainy Torbay, Newfoundland, which is a small town outside of St. John's. I'm the manager of engagement and communications for Memorial University's Leslie Harris Center of Regional Policy and Development. The Harris Center is basically the public policy and outreach arm of the university, and we act as a bridge between communities around the province and the university and help leverage research and resources of Memorial for the responsible development of the economy and society of Newfoundland and Labrador. And a big part of that, and my primary role at the Harris Center, is fostering and stimulating informed discussion on important provincial issues. So of course, this very much fits within that. Climate change is certainly not the sole focus of the Harris Center, and in fact, it's a relatively new focus. So we're all still learning, including me. But we do a lot of research or a lot of work in fostering collaboration, especially when it comes to various levels of government, industry, community, and academia. And I get the impression that that is a big part of what today's discussion is all about. Before we get started, I did want to give you a quick overview of the workshop structure. The workshop has been divided into 4 themes. The themes emerged from the synthesis of the survey Climate Choices conducted back in June. The 4 themes will be discussed over the coming weeks. 3 of them are in Zoom sessions, and 1 of them is an online session just on the online platform. Of course, recognizing that not everyone can attend the Zoom sessions, the organizers have set up the discussion forums for all of them, and Normand mentioned this in his opening remarks as well. We really encourage you to share your ideas and questions and comments on the online forum, as well as during this discussion today, and any longer comments you can submit there as well. It's a great place to share those. And there's also a forum. I think Normand mentioned all those as well. And overall, the workshop aim is to foster constructive dialogue on critical climate choices facing Canada, identify research priorities, opportunities for collaboration and knowledge gaps in Canada's climate change research and policy landscape, help inform the research agenda for the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices, identify opportunities for complementary research across the organizations, and strengthen relationships, among top climate policy researchers and thinkers across Canada. So, I also want to remind you guys that you were all sent a framing document at the beginning. If you've had a chance to read it, that's excellent. It's just a starting point for the discussion, so it's really not meant to limit the discussion. We want to make sure it's really open, and I want to keep things fairly casual and conversational if we can. I know that's how I function and learn best, so I'm going to try and bring that a little bit to the discussion today. I do also want to introduce Dale Burgoyne. I think that's how you pronounce his last name, but you're probably going to have to correct that. And he is going to tell us a little bit about climate choices.
Great, thank you. And it's Dale Bugin. It's been anglicized thoroughly after moving from France to Calgary. So there you go. Well, thank you very much. And I will start by acknowledging that although we are all over the place in the country right now, I at least am on traditional Algonquin territory. And I think it's really important that we notice that and recognize that given that we're talking about stewardship and we're talking about planning for the future, we're planning for impacts across multiple generations. So I think that's something I wanted to note before I started. I am Dale Bugin. I'm the VP of Research at Climate Choices. So a few words about the Institute. We are a relatively new organization with a mandate to provide practical, reasonable, independent advice and research on climate change policies across adaptation and mitigation and clean growth. And maybe most importantly, we are really trying to integrate across those those different issues and those different perspectives to make sure that we don't silo our conversations in maybe the way it has been a little too much historically. The way we deliver our research and our policy advice and our analysis in the Institute is quite interesting. It draws on 3 expert panels and knowledge holders that bring different expertise and knowledge holders from across the country, across disciplines and different perspectives, again, around those 3 issues: adaptation, mitigation, and clean growth. And those experts and knowledge holders kind of ground truth our work in evidence and analysis and make sure that the advice and analysis we put forward to governments across the country at all levels and all orders is robust and sound and grounded in the evidence. Many of you participating in those panels. Many of you are on our advisory group that makes sure our work is not just rooted in good evidence and analysis, but is also rooted in the realities and practical day-to-day nature of this conversation in Canada. And some of you are on our board that make sure what we're doing really is independent and really is the best advice we can put forward to governments. So some of you are not formally involved in those governance structures, and we welcome you as well. Today is a really kind of exciting thing we're trying here to do with the help of our excellent hosts at IET and Uranos. Thank you again for hosting. We're trying to convene some of the best thinkers on all those climate policy issues across Canada and shine some light on what future research priorities and policy priorities for the country should be. That's for the Institute, but it's also for other researchers and other research organizations. And I think that I can commit really seriously that all those governance bodies that are helping guide our work are going to take what we hear today really, really seriously in developing new priorities and new research topics for the Institute. I think the idea there is that a little bit of cooperation and coordination among researchers can take us a pretty long way in moving towards impactful, relevant research and policy advice. That's also a pretty interesting metaphor for the specific topic we're talking today. This idea of coordination and cohabitation across different orders of government, across different policy instruments. It comes up again and again in climate policy in Canada, and it's already woven through lots of pieces of work that the Institute has on the way. So who's doing what? How can federal, Indigenous, provincial, territorial, municipal governments work in complementary ways on climate policy, whether it's mitigation or adaptation? How do different policies interact and complement each other? How can we make that package greater than the sum of the parts? I think that's the frame of the conversation that Louis and Normand and Alain have set up for us in a really helpful way. So that is my quick welcome, but I just wanted to encourage you all to speak very openly and very clearly, and just to state again that we really appreciate the time that you are bringing to this and the intention you are bringing to this. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Dale. I think that's a great introduction to the topic. It is, just in case you're in the wrong session or potentially need a reminder of what session you're in, cohabitation and governance, a need for new policy approaches. And I think a really important question mark was added to the end of that statement. I think that leads to really open discussion that we might have today. Do we need new policy approaches? What might they be? I know my background is not in climate change. It's in all levels of government, and it's in social change. And I can tell you right now, I know climate change is it's complex enough, just from the little bit I have dived into in the last few years. But I know climate change governance in Canada presents a particularly intricate puzzle. It's hard enough to get provinces to cooperate and work together in unison on simple issues, but layer on top of that the fact that climate policy cuts across virtually every other policy area: natural resources, energy, infrastructure, social justice, areas that we already have enough trouble working together on. Not to mention the competing priorities and viewpoints and political differences within each country within each region of the country. There's no wonder that this topic is emerged as one of the top themes for the workshop. And even aside from cooperation across federal and provincial policies, there of course is a need for greater coherence among topics and sectors across government departments and agencies within governments themselves. Because climate change policy cuts across everything, it's easy for lack of coordination within governments to result in conflicting objectives and approaches and unintended negative consequences or negative outcomes. But the fact is, climate change, of course, is everyone's issue. It's global, it's federal, it's provincial, it's right down to the neighborhood and personal level, and it's cross-sectoral and it's multifaceted. So of course, making policies at those levels is going to be a huge challenge. Not to mention making swift policy changes is going to be an even bigger challenge for institutions. So the key questions for us today are what is the research needed to find better ways to integrate policy? What models can we look at? What current policies can be made more effective by applying a cohabitation lens? I would like to turn things over quickly to our conversation starter. But before we get into that, there's a few other things we need to chat about. And my computer has locked up. So you can write a few of any questions you have during the first presentation, during Monica's presentation. You can write it in the chat box. We'll be using that during the Q&A. Monica has about 20 minutes. I think we're running pretty well on time. And then we have 20 minutes for Q&A, and then we'll break out into discussion groups. So with that, I'll pass it over to Monica Gattinger, and I'll ask her to introduce herself. I know she's University of Ottawa, but that's about all I have in my notes. So.
Terrific. Thank you very much. It's a real honor to be here. For those who don't know me, I'm a professor at the University of Ottawa. I'm at the School of Political Studies, but I wear actually two other hats that are probably quite relevant for this conversation. One of which is director of the university's Institute for Science, Society, and Policy. And we do work on energy there. And then the second, as part of that role is that I head a research and engagement program called Positive Energy that I know some of you have been engaged with over the last few years, and we work on issues around strengthening public confidence in energy decision making. So I've got a presentation. I am told I can share my screen. We tried this out earlier and it worked, so let's see if it will still work. Here we go. All right, can everybody see that?
Yes, all good.
Yes.
Great. Okay, so I'm just going to jump. I'll just jump right in. Oh, now of course my computer has frozen. There we go. Okay. I just wanted to, before getting into my comments, just do a really quick recap of the framing document for maybe those who didn't have a chance to get into it. So as was mentioned, the title of this theme is Cohabitation and Governance, New Policy Approaches, ? And the topic has been framed up in essence, you know, to point to the challenges for climate governance in Canada, given political and constitutional realities, and that this, you know, creates challenges when it comes to policies cohabiting together, particularly when coordination or collaboration is difficult to achieve. So there are a number of challenges that the framing document points to: disagreements over jurisdiction, you know, parallel policies developing in multiple jurisdictions without much in the way of coordination, the challenges of regional politics and preferences, lack of coherence across topics or across sectors or across government agencies, you know, whether it's at a single level of government or across levels of government, and then complex and or neglected issues, including Indigenous governance. The framing document ends off with a number of key questions or examples of questions that might be talked about today. So what are some of the frameworks for effectiveness and efficiency when it comes to collaboration? What are some of the benefits of collaboration? What are some new policy approaches that might be needed when it comes to stimulating collaboration? What are some of the policy areas that could benefit from a closer look at the kind of cohabitation reality? And then how does all of this apply, in particular when it comes to transforming natural resources sectors? So for those of you who didn't get a chance to get into the document, that's sort of the recap of the approach. So the remainder of my presentation is really going to focus in on comments that you know, hopefully will help to stimulate debate. And I was told in the preparatory material for this that I'm intended to be an icebreaker, and not in the sense of, you know, get to know you, but in the sense of let's create some kind of new thinking and challenge some of the ideas in the paper, but certainly in the spirit of strengthening it, because it's a very, very strong document to start out with. So here is an overview of my comments, and then the remainder of the slides will kind of go into a bit of more detail on each of them. The first of which, you know, I wondered as I read this if it's worthwhile thinking about renaming this challenge. So I don't know how married, you know, the Institute is to this particular framing or particular name, but it seems to me, and certainly all the work that I've been doing over the last 5-6 years or so, is that what we're really, you know, faced with is the need to not just kind of figure out how we cohabit, but also, and perhaps, you know, more broadly, how do we transform decision making? And that requires institutional innovation. So we talk a lot about innovation when it comes to climate change, whether it's adaptation or mitigation, but when it comes to decision making, certainly the work that I've been doing over the last number of years really points to the need for institutional innovation and a need to transform our decision-making arrangements in the light of new social, political, and environmental realities. So that's sort of the one question I'd like to put on the table. And then in terms of the more specific comments, the first I think would be to encourage folks, or encourage us, to go a little bit deeper, develop a bit more of a finer grained approach to thinking about intergovernmental relations. I'll provide just a very small example of what that might look like. But I think the bulk of my comments are really about encouraging the Institute to cast the net wider. And that, from my perspective, means a number of things. including in a more kind of meaningful way, Indigenous and municipal governments in the research framing. Include implementation, particularly as it relates to the community level. Kathy was mentioning the community level a moment ago, and that's absolutely key. Including climate and energy imperatives. I mean, those who know me know that I'm often, on about energy and the need to sort of think about climate issues and climate action with that energy lens integrated, including regulation. And I know certainly regulation is included in the paper in terms of the overall, it's part of policy, but I think a much closer focus in and an explicit focus on regulation could be quite beneficial. And then the fifth, and certainly by no means last in order of priority, is really looking at some of the emerging political challenges that we see to collaboration, which I think could have come through perhaps a bit more strongly in the paper, and I'd encourage the research agenda to incorporate that. And then this brings me to the final comment, which is, I think it would be useful to think about, would there be benefits to expanding the research tent to grow the climate policy research community? And I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by that. And to also, expand the research tent, not only in terms of who the researchers are that are engaged in this work, but also who the others, the kind of non-researchers are who are engaged in this work. And there I'm going to talk a little bit about co-production. So we'll just get into each of these areas, save the renaming point, which I make here on this slide, and then won't be coming back to it in a separate slide. So in terms of going deeper, and I'm not going to spend time on this slide, but it's just by way of example, there's a lot of folks out there who do work around intergovernmental relations, particularly as they relate to federalism. I've done some work in this space, and lots of researchers have created different ways of kind of unpacking what collaboration looks like. And this is just an example of a spectrum that I've developed in previous research to kind of help look a little bit more closely at what is the nature of relations between governments on whatever the policy issue is, in this case, obviously on climate, and then, kind of what kind of federalism does that relate to, and, where are there policy issues, or where are there topic areas where maybe we want to be nudging governments or looking more closely at what some of the obstacles are to greater levels of collaboration or coordination and the like. Because one of the things I would point out is that I'm often asked by people when I travel, internationally, well, why isn't there more collaboration in Canada around energy issues, and what are the constitutional obstacles to collaboration? And I say there are no constitutional obstacles to collaboration. The Constitution does not put in place any obstacles to governments collaborating. What is often the obstacle is about its mindsets or its interests or its values and the like. And so looking at this a little bit more closely in the way in which governments might be incentivized to collaborate more is something that I would certainly suggest in terms of going deeper on this front. And there's lots of folks who've done work in this space. Getting into casting the net wider, and I think this is really my main comment here, is this series of areas where I suggest or encourage casting the net a bit wider. I think, including Indigenous and municipal governments is really going to be key in this work. The framing document did a great job of laying out some of the issues for federal and provincial governments, didn't get too much into Indigenous and municipal, but one of the things that we've seen over the last number of years, and I suspect this is going to grow going forward, I mean, I'm imagining this is a research agenda that goes over the next couple of decades, there's a growing role, influence, and authority of both Indigenous and municipal governments in energy and climate decision-making. And yet some of our decision-making, and institutional arrangements haven't really caught up with that. So if you think about Indigenous governments, for example, increasingly the starting point, and Perry Bellegarde is AFN National Chief Perry Bellegarde is often says nothing about us without us. And we are increasingly seeing that in terms of whether it's, the application of traditional knowledge, equity partnerships in energy projects, the important role that Indigenous communities are and can play in environmental stewardship, including Indigenous-led standards development for environmental and impact assessment. Municipal governments as well are increasingly engaged on these issues, whether it's in terms of community energy planning or distributed energy. We're seeing a much greater level of engagement of municipalities. They are, I think, as Kathy mentioned, they are the ones who are closest to citizens. So again, casting the net a little bit wider to think about how do we need to transform our decision-making arrangements? Where do we need to innovate in terms of our decision-making institutions, not only Fed-Prov, but also including Indigenous and municipal as well. Which brings me to the second point, which is around implementation. I think that researchers in the climate policy space and activists in the climate policy space have been extremely effective at getting climate issues on the policy agenda. I think where we need to maybe strengthen more is at that implementation level. So, okay, we know what needs to be done, but how do we actually make that happen? Whether it's in the real worlds of energy or politics or regional differences or mistrust or misinformation, what have you. So really getting into that implementation piece. And I think this is particularly important at the community level. And by way of example, I would point to how pivotal community support is for new infrastructure. And whether we're talking about greening the electricity grid or pushing very hard, which Canada will need to do on electrification, that's going to mean a whole lot more infrastructure. And community support for that infrastructure is going to be pivotal, which means kind of moving to the what of that climate policy element to the how of making it happen. Implementation, my background is in public admin. Implementation in policy studies is often referred to as the dismal science of public policy because it's so hard to do. And there are far more case studies of failure than there are of success because it's difficult stuff. Continuing on casting the net wider. This again is where I'll kind of come back to something that I've really, my own sort of drum is this importance of thinking about not only climate imperatives, but also how those interface with and ideally align with energy imperatives. It's many times collaboration in Canada is challenged by concerns over affordability, securability, reliability, competitiveness, investment climate, you name it, on and on. And so thinking about how do climate and energy, how can they be integrated, how can they be aligned, making sure that there's that energy lens brought to this research, I think would also be quite beneficial. Moving into regulation, many of the challenges that we see, I think, in terms of moving forward on climate, in terms of collaboration on climate, often are playing out in the regulatory system. And so thinking through, how do we strengthen decision-making in that system, strengthen collaboration in the regulatory decision-making system. It's not just about policy development, it's also about regulation. So it's not just about, that collaboration at that first minister's level, it's also collaboration between our regulatory agencies, whether it's impact assessment with, the Canada Energy Regulator or across to provincial levels as well. And then the final area where I would really encourage the Institute to cast the net wider is to include in this research agenda emerging political challenges to collaboration. I've just listed a few here, but these are some of the areas that my work has been engaging with over the last number of years. So polarization, the challenges increasingly that we're seeing in Canada around partisan politics, and many of these issues polarized along partisan lines in ways that make evidence-based or evidence-informed decision-making very challenging to undertake. Misinformation or disinformation, how to counter that, particularly in the social media landscape. motivated reasoning, which is sort of fancy academic talk for those who aren't familiar with that area of literature, is, you know, the extent to which people's views around issues, particularly risk perception, can often be motivated more by, you know, their identities and worldviews than by the quote unquote evidence per se. And that the more that we begin to see reasoning, particularly around issues like risk perception, that reasoning gets motivated along group identity or along worldview lines, the more that we actually can have real challenges to undertake collaboration, to undertake, you know, evidence-informed decision-making. In line with this, declining and shifting trust in institutions. So if you look at the Edelman Trust Barometers over the last number of years, you see not only that trust has declined in institutions and in some years in science and expertise as well. But I think more than anything, what comes forward in much of that research, and certainly in the research that I've undertaken as well, is that trust is really in flux. Who or what people trust and with what level of commitment is changing quite substantially. And that again can represent a pretty hefty challenge to collaboration if you don't have that trust. And here I'm not just talking about, you know, individual Canadians, it's also within our energy and environmental and climate policy communities that you can see that mistrust, you can see you know, polarization along various lines, and then trying to get to collaboration can be really difficult in that environment. So, you know, what I would love to see as a research agenda coming out of this is, you know, focusing on some of those, that sort of bucket of issues, but untangling the respective influence of each of those factors, not only on the willingness to collaborate, but I would also really point to the importance of the durability of collaboration and decisions. So we've seen, you know, windows of opportunity for collaboration, like the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change, but the durability of that collaboration being challenged, as we saw in the years that followed, as a result of, you know, some of the factors that I've pointed to here. So almost at the end, you know, as I was reading the documentation for all of these sessions and sort of thinking about what the Climate Institute is trying to accomplish, and I really appreciate Dale's introductory remarks, because it sounds to me like that the Institute's really trying to move in this direction. You know, is it worth thinking about expanding the research tent, growing the climate policy research community? And there are probably multiple ways you can do this, but two that come to my mind are in disciplinary and thematic terms. Now, I'm not at all trying to say that there aren't already political scientists, folks in public administration, sociology, and whatnot involved in the climate policy research community. But I think we need more representation from some of these disciplines, particularly to deal with a number of the factors that you know, that I've raised in this presentation. I think in terms of thematic terms, again, you know, coming back to the drum I beat here on this one around energy policy and regulation, but it's not just that. It's also about federalism. You know, there is a really strong community of federalism scholars in Canada and internationally, you know, bringing some of those folks more into this tent. You know, Indigenous scholars, people who do scholars who do research on Indigenous issues. Same could be said for polarization and partisanship, just by way of a few examples. And then what I would end on, and I think again, I'm hearing from Dale that the Institute is kind of moving in this direction, is the importance of what I term co-production models. So working in genuine partnership with users of the research and those who will be influenced and impacted by research that comes out of the Institute, to try to maximize both the relevance and traction of that research. And so, you know, that certainly means federal, provincial, territorial, Indigenous, municipal governments. It means representatives from civil society, representatives from industry, and the like. I recognize that's a very tall order, but in terms of trying to maximize that relevance and traction, it's something that I would really encourage the Institute to do. And that is where I end. So looking forward to people's comments. I've seen all these stuff coming in on the chat. I haven't read any of it, so I'll leave it to Kathy, to our chair, to help us for the next part of this discussion.
Thanks so much, Monica. I have also been trying to read through the chat, but also trying to pay attention to what you've been saying. It's been a really interesting opening so far. It's funny. I feel like I got asked to chair this session, and I felt a little bit out of my element. But I tell you, there are so many things that are clearly top of mind for a lot of different places when it comes to engagement at the community level and the municipal level, and the role of Indigenous governments in collaboration. And in Newfoundland and Labrador, of course, we're faced in an oil economy. We're faced with a particular catch-22 for climate impacts. And I think all this discussion is really interesting food for thought at this point in our life cycle at the Harris Center. I want to open it up it'll give me a chance to read through the questions. If I open it up and just say, does anyone have any first initial response to Monica's spiel? And then I'll look through the questions and see where we can direct it. Anyone who's kind of posted in the chat who'd like to kick it off, I am scanning for hands. Rebecca.
Hi there, Rebecca World, Director of Engagement at the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. So I work closely with Dale and Co. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for the presentation and for the really good comments. And I do want to connect either here, certainly, and then perhaps in the breakout groups, a connection on the recommendation to widen the tent, certainly for the Institute. And I really appreciate that comment. And I want to provide a little bit of framing about the work that we do, so that discussions are informed about ways to improve that, ways to center that, etc. So some of the work that we do, of course, this workshop, for example, is one approach that we take in terms of trying to draw in diversity of voices, broader voices. The survey that you saw earlier, you may have seen earlier, again, another attempt to draw in voices. And then throughout the work that we do at the Institute, before the research agenda is established, while the research is underway, and then as we launch the research, part of my role, or the role that I have, is to lead a small team to connect with diversity of folks. And I really wanted to just emphasize that again, so that these conversations about widening the tent are grounded in some of the work that we do, so that we can broaden that and or refine that as needed.
Thank you, Rebecca. You did break up there for a second. I don't know if anyone wants to fill in what you might have been saying. Normand, did you have something to add?
Yes, I just wanted to get back on what you were saying, Monica. Because you say, you have to change the structure in some way. And so the position of the paper, which I kind of defined a bit, but just to push you on this side, do we have time to do these reorganization, these institutional reorganization, if we want to move at the speed we need to move? And also, community is important, but a lot of the emissions, a lot of the problems are not at the community basis. They are industrial, there are decisions on how you build that stuff. So, somehow the focus is interesting on community, but is it really where the problem is if we want to get to zero emission? And should we wait to see changes, or can we design approaches that doesn't involve huge structural changes or way of doing stuff?
Yeah, it would be interesting to actually, as a researcher, of course, I'd say, well, we need to do more research on this. I think one of the, if the decision-making arrangements aren't transformed, and I'm thinking here in particular, I had a quick read through some of the comments, but in particular, the role and place of Indigenous governments, I think we're going to forever be taking one step forward and two steps back. And there are some fascinating changes already happening on the ground that aren't happening as a result of pointy-headed academics like us, thinking deep thoughts in our home offices somewhere. But people and organizations who are actually doing some really phenomenal work. And I'm thinking, for example, the First Nations Major Projects Coalition in British Columbia that has done some really interesting, work with multiple Indigenous communities in British Columbia to develop Indigenous-led standards for environmental impact assessment. And I see, to your point about speed, I think one of the things that I've seen in our work is that many of the organizations who we need to change are quite aware that they need to change. We do a lot of work with regulators, and they are very alive to this idea that in the absence of change, we're going to forever be stuck in sort of a rut of opposition, lack of collaboration, court cases. So I think, the research question there would be, what's going to get us there faster? Change that doesn't transform our systems, but could be subject to a lot of pushback, as and everybody can point to some examples of that, or transforming systems, maybe identifying, and perhaps that's what this research could do, identifying where the key priority areas are that we need to make changes, we need to transform, prioritize that, and then put in place decision-making arrangements that might be far more durable with sustainable collaboration over time. And then finally, to your point, Normand, on community, I don't disagree with you at all. I think action is going to be required at multiple levels. I think one of the reasons I was perhaps the presentation perhaps came across as putting an exclusive focus on community or a high focus on community was because I didn't see it in the paper. So we're not disagreeing there, Normand, not at all. It's an and as opposed to an or.
Great. Cheyenne McKay, I noticed you had a couple of comments there and a great example. I don't know if you wanted to speak to that specifically.
Sure, just when the comment, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
I just got this new headset, I'm just trying it out. Yeah, so when we're talking about collaborative opportunities, I was thinking about the Collaborative Leadership Initiative, which is, it was being started by CEER, the Center for Indigenous Environmental Resources. But it's a group of mayors, chiefs, and reeves within a 200-kilometer radius of Winnipeg that have met several times and have signed a memorandum of understanding that they're going to work together. And they've tackled different issues like with sustainable waste management, and they're working on water quality trading regimes presently. But they've been able to break into quadrants now, where they're now tackling smaller groups. And this is like a group of 28 First Nations. So they're easily, climate change could be on this table and different measures and impacts. So I definitely agree with Monica's comment that we should look into those type of Indigenous engagements with municipalities, I think are really key right now as ways to tackle these big, hairy, audacious goals that everybody has.
Yeah, that's great. I think using some existing groups like that is an interesting take rather than trying to set something up new, look at what groups exist to tackle other issues and whether or not climate change can be added to that agenda is a neat approach. Hélène, you had some comments there second, I think you were the second one out, about different policy fields in Canada where collaborations are considered successful. And I know, I mean, like I mentioned before, my background is a lot more in social policy. I worked with the National Homelessness Initiative for years, and that was a really innovative approach to kind of a complex issue with federal, provincial, municipal, and Indigenous collaboration. And it was set up, like I said, it's a very different framework than we usually would implement funding, both for research and for projects. Did you want to speak a little bit to your comment on some of the other successful cross-discipline areas?
Yeah, so that was a question, really. I'm sure that in the policy world, we probably have done some very good stuff, connecting national, provincial, municipal interests in a joint way to advance. So that was more around my question. I keep hearing about the infrastructure programs. Of course, it's the federal government, putting down billions of dollars. So maybe that explains it. But also, similarly, I mean, we could look also at the European Union and how they handle the adaptation portfolio and the reduction of greenhouse gases approaches, etc. So what's compatible there that could be applied to Canada? Maybe there's other models in other countries, in Switzerland, for example, where they have a confederation system, etc. So I guess that was a bit more of a question. Is there still more work to look elsewhere, what happened, and try to find if it would be applicable to Canada, or if it's not applicable, what could we tweak to create innovation in that field?
Yeah, where can we look to see for models rather than reinventing the wheel? Does anyone have any other comments on that?
Yeah, if I could just, and I think Alain, you've probably laid out the question that needs to be answered and a way of answering it. So I would just add a couple of thoughts to that. I think, looking internationally and looking domestically, but across to other sectors is definitely useful, but with a few, caveats, I think, in terms of kind of what's comparable and where are we likely to find the juiciest lessons, so to speak. And I think you're quite right, where we've tended to see domestically good Fed-Prov municipal collaboration is when there's money on the table. That definitely helps, but on many of these issues, it's not just about money, it's about, regulation and other sorts of measures that might make it a little bit tougher to get that collaboration. So I think it'd be good to look for some examples where there's other policy instruments at play. And then I think internationally, looking to other federations, and I would encourage us again to look at other federations with, with large natural resource bases, so that you've got that comparability there, or at least some level of comparability in terms of some of the challenges. Australia, in my mind, comes up as a really interesting comparator. It's another federation, indigenous communities, large resource base, but there would be others as well. The U.S. to some extent too, the UK to some extent too. So there's certainly, I think, it's something we can learn from the international level, but need to look at that carefully. The other thing, last thing, I would say is that there's been a lot of work that's already been done on this. I think I saw Nathan Lemford's on the line. He's done some great work in this space. Part of this could be like a meta review as opposed to original research, much more about kind of a state of knowledge piece.
Thanks, Monica. I did have a note here that Daniel Henstra has had his hand up. Sorry, I missed that. Did you have a comment?
Yeah, just to what Alain was saying. Hello to everyone, by the way, and thanks for organizing all of this. Yeah, I did wonder whether there is space for intergovernmental agreements, something that sort of more formalizes this. Now, of course, we do have the Pan-Canadian Framework, which is kind of an intergovernmental agreement in the same kind of flavor as some other agreements like the Social Union Framework Agreement of the late 90s and the Health Accord of 2004. And so it does what a lot of those other intergovernmental agreements also did, which is to set out some clear principles for an area of shared public policy, in this case, climate change and clean growth. It does commit the two orders of government to pursuing some common goals. It typically establishes some kind of an intergovernmental council or secretariat, so those things are valuable. And to Alain's question, in the evaluation of these things, I think some of them that have been seen as being more effective than others have been in areas like agriculture, immigration, and in labor market training, I believe. I mean, I haven't studied these areas, but just from some reviews that I've seen. In fact, there was an article published in 2018 by some big Canadian scholars in intergovernmental relations, and they looked at the conditions that facilitate multilateral collaboration in intergovernmental relations. And long story short, what they found is what works is an overarching multilateral agreement that sets out common priorities, but then also supplementary bilateral agreements between the federal government and the provinces. So again, the the Pan-Canadian framework is this overarching multilateral document, but what we don't have is any of these bilateral agreements with the provinces. And that is where we get the detail on implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. And it's those last three pieces that are almost always missing beyond these high-level, lofty, shared principles. And so, again, now there are some strengths to these agreements. They give an official record of the will to cooperate, they provide a focal point, but of course they have all kinds of weaknesses as well. For one thing, they historically have excluded municipal and indigenous governments. They're largely symbolic. They can't be enforced in the courts. It requires a voluntary commitment by the various levels of government. And they're also vulnerable to political turnover if a new government at either level of government comes into office and says, we're not really committed to these shared goals. So I don't know. So I don't know what my conclusion is here, but we do have a Pan-Canadian framework. But again, I think we're only at the level of this overarching set of principles, and we haven't really moved forward. And of course, it's very new, but we haven't really moved forward into any of these bilateral agreements or giving them teeth for implementation and monitoring and evaluation. So for what it's worth.
Thanks, Daniel. Graham Reed also had a question, I think, or had his hand raised.
Yeah, thanks. And Anine, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see those faces on the line. I guess I had two reflections, one being one of the conversations that we haven't had, and that's not like superbly fleshed out within the framing document, is the question of equity and who's at the table and who's making decisions. And I think as part of the kind of model of cohabitation, we also need to think about, who's making decisions where and how. And I think in the Pan-Canadian framework, there is kind of recognition that, that this kind of imposed legislative framework is the only way in which we can make decisions. And in fact, the comment that I made about decolonization is particularly relevant in that frame, and also I think relevant in how do we approach equitable relationships in kind of these frameworks. And I think that might require some kind of critical thought about how we can't do the same thing that we've always done with large tweaks or little tweaks is what we're slightly talking about right now. And so I think I'd encourage kind of the Institute and others to think a little bit about, what is the exact problem that we're contending with, and then how do we develop solutions on that basis. And in academic terms, we're talking about problem identification, which I think is often overlooked when engaging in the climate policy discourse. And I guess from my perspective, really thinking about colonization and the history of Canada is integral to then thinking about what are some of the solutions to addressing this. And so I apologize, I do have to run to another meeting, but I want to say thanks for all the gray matter and intelligence around the room, and look forward to any further discussion. So Chimigwech.
Thanks, Graham. Looking forward to it. Normand, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I mean, because Graham just left, but I mean, the idea at this point is for us to try, because he was kind of saying the Institute should try to think about this, but the idea is that for next 5 hours or so, it's the goal of people around the table to think about this and try to identify either research questions better defined or issues that need to be pushed forward. And again, I want to emphasize to me that we are in a context where we more or less have to get to zero net emissions in 30 years, in less than 30 years. So there's the question of how do you get there efficiently also? And I agree that there's a lot of issues in Canada that we need to solve. And the question is also, should we solve everything at the same time, or should we focus on what's the way to get there? And so my last point before shutting up is that we have 3 teams, and the social teams is treated as another team of integrated. This one here is more about governance and relations and how to build structurally. So I would, as people split a bit later, make sure just to remind you that other teams will be discussed somewhere else also. So it would be interesting to keep a certain focus to to get a richer dialogue that we can construct by the end of this activity.
Can I respond to that quickly? Because I think that's actually one of the fundamental flaws within climate policy, is this desire to split things up that are inherently linked to one another. And, you know, I recognize the kind of point of this discussion being, you know, how do we generate questions for that? But I think the last thing that we should do is kind of further silo our conversations in a way that's kind of unproductive to responding to the problem. And I think the problem you identified as being net zero is great, but it still focuses heavily on GHG reductions. And so, you know, what I'm interested in is how do we have a kind of equitable, well-being based society that addresses and builds resiliency for all of our future little ones. And I think, you know, governance is one part of that, equity is one part of that. Also kind of re-identifying what we're all focusing on is equally important. And so, you know, I guess my kind of reflection is that the thing that we need to do, recognizing that we all have specialties and kind of areas of expertise, is really think about, you know, how do we break down those and start to kind of think of these as integrated problems that need to be addressed that way. And if anything, you know, I think the pandemic that we're all living through gives us a perfect example as to why we can't do the things that we've always done. And so hopefully through that motivation and through the identification of systemic inequalities that are you know, further exacerbated by these sorts of crises, we can start to have the kind of transformative change that I think Monica identified that should be required to think about how we transform those systems. So I actually have to go now, but look forward to how we move that integrated thinking forward.
Well, thanks to Graham. I know he's already signed off, but I think he did a good job of kind of pulling it back to the beginning of the conversation when Monica talked about how we need to kind of reform the institutions in a way in order to get to that point where we can have effective, cohesive collaboration within policy.